Portugal, you'll read how 50 ultra-right-wing MPs have just been elected by the most illiterate society in Europe.
E aquela pia ali, vinha empregado com o burro ou com o burro, vendiam lá aqui no argol.
This is 50 years after the Carnation Revolution, an essentially socialist overthrow of a dictator that had been in place 50 years. Bloodless, helped by some army officers, the population would put carnations down the barrels of the guns of soldiers. Salazar had had his time anyway. Salazar was a dictator that had come to power in the 1920s, long before Mussolini and Hitler, and even Franco, Spain. You'll read how things go in cycles, around and around. Perhaps they're trying to frighten us that we've got 50 years of fascists. Fascists now. But Salazar's 1926 coup d'etat was really very moderate as far as dictatorships go. Salazar's coup d'etat replaced the 1910 to 1926 First Republic of Portugal. The First Republic was a very poor country at a time when Britain and France, in the Edwardian era and fin de siècle, they were luxuriating in a golden era with all the profits of empire and the Enlightenment. The First Republic was a sort of cooperative, slightly unstable government, with everyone finding their feet for the first time after centuries of monarchy. The last of the Hapsburgs had come to an end, most famously the Hapsburg. Brothers, one that controlled Iberia, Spain and Portugal, and another that controlled Austria, parts of Switzerland, Poland, and Burgundy in France, and of course Holland, the Netherlands. The two brothers and their Jewish businessmen that traded between Poland, Holland and Portugal, though not really enough of them after the Inquisition, and of course traded across the 7 trade routes across the 7 oceans, 7 circles of trade. Salazar, though balancing the books, that dictator didn't like America and its financial model any more than it liked the communists. So really, then
As leis da física falham e a vertical de qualquer lugar oscila sem se deter e deixa de ser perpendicular.
So really, the new far-right MPs in Portugal are much worse than the dictator. The new Portuguese far-right have been able to take advantage of the illiteracy of the people of Portugal, just the same as the closest to illiterate in Britain have been taken advantage of by Brexiteers. It's them who voted for them. And all those fascist tourists, the people want a miracle. The Catholic Church in all Catholic countries of Europe had owned a third of everything economic since the start of the Holy Roman Empire, really, right up to the end of the Hapsburg monarchy. Jewish businessmen in Iberia had done fairly well up until the Spanish Inquisition, which was also in Portugal, and did very well after it, so long as they lapsed. Obviously a few people disappeared, but it wasn't the worst pogrom ever, if you were willing to bend and sway with the wind. Crypto-Jews and New Christians. But they eventually had to conduct their business from Holland, most dominant of the Netherlands, that was draining the Rhine River Delta with the help of windmill pumps to create a country. The crypto-Jews also went off to the colonies and were a huge part of the global trade of the Seven Oceans, so much so that the King of Spain, wanting to fund his foreign wars, didn't feel like he could ask the merchant classes for a loan to fund his armies and navy. The strategy of the flotilla, though, where lots of ships, a limited number of times a year, crossed the Atlantic with the gold and the silver from the colonies to Spain, it was very successful and intimidated the privateers of Britain, Holland, France. The sailing pilots, not pirates, pilots of North Africa were the brain, the guiding force of Magellan and all his discoveries. 5,000 years ago, the Egyptians had started using sails to carry reed boats down the Nile River. 1500 BC, Persia, Iran, was using similar sails to pump cooling water to the palaces and the people. 12th century, windmills were getting to Europe, probably partly due to knowledge brought from the Crusades. The Dutch put them to good use, the Portuguese made the most of the windy environment and came up with a couple of different designs. Perhaps the most interesting one is that the whole of the triangular roof on top of a circular tower actually rotates according to where the wind's coming from and where the sails are catching it. And there's the huge wooden, heavy-looking mechanisms inside that grind a stone wheel against another stone wheel roller, really. For sails, most of them the 19th century of what's now, but the 12th century to 1874-ish. Windmills had Portugal, Holland, the Netherlands had the sails of the ships on the sea, the canals, and it had the windmills, the sails on the windmills. It developed differently to the rest of Europe, that had more coal, and adapted to their automobile, the car, the lorry, much later. Holland, that little outlier from the Burgundy Empire of the Hapsburgs, was disproportionately inventive and prosperous. They had the trade from the Baltic Sea all the way round the world, except for the impenetrable flotillas of gold and silver. I say that, but for decades all they were able to do was harass the Portuguese trade on the Seven Ocean circular routes. A quarter of the trading ships that were lost of the Portuguese weren't really captured. There were a couple of high-profile cases, but they ended up being wrecked because of weather. The Dutch harassed them into sailing at times of year that they didn't really want to, when the weather was inappropriately bad. Portugal still had all the spices and all the sugar, and considered that it owned all the ocean. In Roman times, the ocean was owned by Rome. Now it was owned by Portugal. But then the oceans became free. Slowly it became accepted that the distance that a cannonball could fly from your land, a 3-mile zone, was all the sea that a country could claim. Portugal's regions, economic regions, political regions, were connected by ocean and connected by sail ships. The people on one side of the world were part of Portugal, just based on ability. Sportspersons, generals were black and an integral part of Portugal, and always have been. And it's hardly surprising that Portugal supports, and Iberia more generally, supports Palestinian human rights and the right to be a country as forthrightly as they rightly do. Iberia and Portugal was getting poorer, much like its what we would call colonies, who were integrated into the whole. Portugal got poorer as it slowly lost its spice trade and sugar and its merchant classes to the Dutch, the British and the French. And it had to buy those things for its own people from its enemies, so to speak, and use up its vast wealth. Just one flotilla ship in the early days was half the British or Dutch national income for the year, for the whole country. Salt was found and used from Portugal rather than the other side of the world, but it took a while for even such a staple to be financially stable. And windmill power saw Portugal through all these transitionary centuries. 400 or 500 years of buying the staples for the people is where all the Iberian gold went to. A bit like how Haiti, the Caribbean island, is asking for its debt that it paid back to compensate slave owners for their rebellion. Only very recently, they were in a stranglehold once marine armies started invading places like Goa in India. Hardwoods from the New World partly helped the windmills. The mechanism certainly improved them, and the longevity, reliability, accuracy, strength. That axle that the crisscross of poles attached to, and those sails in turn attached to. The walls of the towers of the windmill are often 1 metre thick dry stone walls without any lime or cement, rendered on the outside to protect them. Big, chunky cork trees support the weight over a short span, but they've been abandoned. The horrendous economy of Portugal has meant people moving to the city like everywhere. You can't help but think that the strangest thing about these windmills might have driven them away. There's pots, and these pots are supposed to act a bit like flutes, and as the wind blows over the flute it makes a noise. Perhaps it's supposed to be a little bit like those electric cars that sort of say they've been given a noise, and they're supposed to be saying, Sails are spinning around, it's dangerous here. But perhaps it's just an identity thing, perhaps it's advertising. Here we are, come and get your corn ground. But on a good spot, there's often a few windmills competing for business, and tuning your windmill through your pots to a sound that presumably you like, or is a sound of your own, it needs to be coordinated with your neighbouring windmill whistling noises, so that it's something of a harmonising or distinctive tune. They are loud and can be heard for miles. Those howling clay jars strapped to the wood, huzios, they're powerful things, and you need quite a lot of corn to bother to get them working. They have to be worked every week to stop the wood warping in the wrong directions. There aren't many of them. People have turned them into accommodation, Airbnb places. Few have the inside workings still present. But as a farmer would say, why would you spend £25,000 on restoring a windmill when you can have much better accommodation for £5,000? So they're just left to decay. They've naturally enough got great views, but are you going to go to the middle of nowhere on top of a mountain, near no decent restaurants, and live like a peasant because there's a scenic feature building that's good for Instagram, perhaps with a hot tub? I might do, actually. That does sound alright. I saw 125,000 for what is really quite a tiny building, in places where you can get a mansion for that much. Don't get me wrong, places like Arasara you can't get anything for 125,000. It's the Windmill Coast. I wonder how long Western society that doesn't grow its own food could have lasted for if COVID had continued for the indefinite 2-year period that it should have been to even approve a vaccine. Portugal is a strangle-held third world country within Europe that's being colonised by America.